Welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, has the Gillard government blown $6 billion a year on the budget bottom line? Are Australians a pack of whingers when it comes to the cost of living? And why Paul Howes thinks mining executives are a bunch of shiny asses. Our panel tonight, David Marr from the Sydney Morning Herald, Annabel Crabb from ABC Online, and in Melbourne, Tim Wilson from the Institute of Public Affairs. Well, the political debate continued today over the funerals for asylum seekers who died in the Christmas Island boat tragedy. After questioning the government's decision to hold the services in Sydney and pay for relatives to attend, Shadow Minister for Immigration Scott Morrison conceded his timing had been insensitive.
No one's going to ever accuse me, I think, of not, taking this matter up to the government and holding them to account. But timing in terms of comments, I think, is very important. The timing of my comments over the last 24 hours was insensitive and was inappropriate.
And his leader, Tony Abbott, agreed that Mr Morrison had gone too far.
The Coalition will always have a tough border protection policy, but we will never depart from being humane. And I want to thank Scott for being man enough to accept that perhaps we did go a little bit too far yesterday.
But the opposition kept pushing for the funeral costs to be made public. The Minister for Immigration has defended funding the flights, which he estimates cost around $300,000.
So we consulted, and the Federal Police consulted with the families, and in those instances where families said we've got relatives in Sydney who can look after the grave, tend the grave, and that's where we would settle if we get to stay in Australia, we agreed to that request. I think that's appropriate. The alternative is to say we insist that we'll bury people at Christmas Island, or you can bury people in Sydney, but we're not going to let you come to the funeral of your son or your father. I wasn't prepared to do that.
Annabel, it seems like Scott Morrison is apologising not for the comments, but the timing of the comments.
Yeah, there's kind of a bit of a meeting in the middle going on, I think, between Joe Hockey and Scott Morrison over, where they seemed to be yesterday. Scott Morrison has sort of retracted the timing but not the content of his remarks, and Joe Hockey, in a separate interview today, continued to profess his determination that people should be allowed to attend their own family's funerals, but kind of gave a bit of a green light to Mr Morrison's continued pursuit of questions about the costs involved and in the decision to stage the funerals and the burials here in Sydney rather than in Christmas Island.
David, Tony Abbott said that Scott Morrison was man enough to make an apology today. What are your thoughts on that?
Rubbish. Man enough. Man enough to say that he only should have poured this appalling spite on these people today rather than yesterday. That takes being a man, does it? Well, there really is a question here. What kind of man would say such a thing under such circumstances? These people died in a shipwreck, the causes of which have yet to be determined. And there are deep questions about the response and the capacity of Australia to respond and rescue those people. Why did it take an hour and a half for a Navy boat and a customs boat to come around a point and try and pick these people up? An hour and a half. Now, there are big questions here, but even if these people hadn't been in an appalling shipwreck, they aren't to be treated like animals like this. Convicted murderers are allowed out to go to their families' funerals. These people are not criminals. They are ludicrously housed on a rock off the coast of Indonesia, where the Ombudsman recently said, what are they doing there? I mean, they ought not to be there. They ought not to have to fly families in for these funerals. People ought not to die. But if you're going to continue to use Christmas Island as the holding ground for these people, you will continue to be met with the ludicrous cost of doing so. And this is just part of that cost.
Tim Wilson, what's your take on this?
Well, firstly, I think it needs to be made clear that nobody was actually arguing these people shouldn't be able to go to a funeral. It came down to who people felt it should be paying for the cost of those people who are going to a funeral. But it's also a reality of the consequences of our border protection system. We have a strong system, a tough system, which is designed to deter people, but when people come here, we also have an obligation to support them. I think a lot of Australians would be more comfortable if these people were lent the money to fly to a funeral than the taxpayer paid for them, because I think it clearly sets a precedent which will continue to be met. The only hope is that it doesn't need to be met because people won't die in the high seas.
One of the weirdest things about the last 24 hours is that we've spent so much of it talking about this particular issue. And, I think there are all sorts of discussions to be had about the procedures and the policies that Australia has in place and where the sort of costs that they incur. Surely, on the vastness of that issue, the issue of who foots the bill for some incredibly unfortunate people whom we watched in the most horrible television footage that I can recall, watched be smashed apart, But that's the smallest issue, I think.
But there's another thing here. Money is no object in border protection. Scott Morrison is calling for the restoration of the Pacific Solution. The Pacific Solution cost roughly $600,000 per head of the 1,500 people who went through it. $600,000 a head. And he is begrudging, Scott Morrison is begrudging and making this horrible political issue, carrying what favour he can in what remote corners of Australia's fears, from a funeral of these people tragically killed in the most appalling circumstances in front of Australians who could do nothing for them.
Annabel, I want to ask you about Joe Hockey's comments today, a bit more about that. Why do you think he backtracked a little bit and said Scott Morrison is right to be able to ask these questions?
Well, I don't know the exact answer to that. All I can assume is that there would have been a bit of a huddle overnight because at a time when Tony Abbott doesn't want any division in his ranks. I mean, he kind of clonked some heads together the previous weekend over a few interviews that people gave to various newspapers, said, look, I don't want people contradicting each other in public and so on anymore. So I assume that there was a bit of a round-table discussion in which the edges were knocked off everybody's approach. So that seems to be kind of a conciliatory gesture from Joe Hockey saying, well, look, you're not wrong to raise the issue of expense. It's just that, I don't want us to be seen as prohibiting relatives from attending funerals. I mean, I assume that that's the reason for it.
Tim, did you think Scott Morrison pushed it too far and that he was right to pull back a slight bit?
Well, I think he probably shouldn't have answered the question in the way he did in the first place. But it needs to be. We also need to realise that the government hasn't exactly been standing up for its position on this issue as well. From the transcripts I read of yesterday's releases, Chris Bowen has been pretty cagey about whether he was the one responsible for authorising this, because I'm sure there's no doubt there is a sensitivity within the Australian public about whether they think people should be paying for this. And Chris Bowen needs to respond to whether he was the one authorising or whether the department is the one running the agenda.
Didn't he just say in that clip that we just saw, didn't he say that...
laid it all out, didn't he?
He inferred it a bit stronger, but...
He said I couldn't... he said it was a question of telling people that they couldn't attend their own family's funerals, and I wasn't prepared to do that. That's... Sounds to me like he's
But again, no one's questioning whether people should be able to attend their own family funeral at all, and I think doing that would be an absolute disgrace. But again, it comes back to he has in that statement made some suggestion that he was, but yesterday he wasn't, and he was running away from it as fast as Scott Morrison was.
OK, moving on to other issues, and the government is once again being forced to defend its mining tax, Mark II. Freedom of Information documents released by the Treasury reveal the revised model will collect $38.5 billion over 10 years. That's $60 billion less than the original super profits tax. But the Prime Minister says she'll stand by the deal she struck with mining companies.
We always understood that with a mining tax that was going to tax on the basis of profits, that there would be years that there were high tax collections, but there would be years when there are lower tax collections. We will deliver through the Australian Parliament the tax as I agreed it with Australia's biggest mining companies. We will not be compromising that agreement in order to secure the legislation through.
We announced a replacement of the RSPT with the MRRT, an entirely different resource rent tax. We said at the time it would raise less revenue than expected by the former proposal. It does. There's nothing new in what is being said today.
So, David, the new tax will cost the government $60 billion over 10 years. Is that a lost opportunity, do you think, to make some money out of the mining boom?
Well, it's good to know the price tag for getting the miners off Labor's back during the election campaign. $60 billion over 10 years. It's pretty extraordinary.
It also makes the miners' $22 million investment in the ad campaign look like pretty smart money, doesn't it?
Oh, it was very smart money. I mean, $22 billion. Get rid of the Prime Minister, or, help ease the Prime Minister out. Take a $60 billion cut for the revenue and get the silence of the mining company for a few weeks. And then, of course, once the elections are over, the miners start whinging again about the horrors of this tax they're going to have to face. It's pretty sad. I mean, other countries in the world have been able to tax windfall profits from minerals and oil exploration. They've been able to do it. Norway, a wonderful example of doing it. Everybody, in the end, was quite happy with that arrangement. We are giving away to the shareholders of BHP and Rio a huge amount of money.
Tim Wilson, the IPA believes in paying less taxes. Do you think this is a good result, $60 billion less being paid over the next 10 years?
Well, I think everybody needs to realise that even the mining companies didn't argue against a resource rent tax. What they argued against was the model and the rate at which it cut in. But I do think that the government needs to always look at options to cut tax. Absolutely. And that includes the mining industry, because if you look at what the government's saying today, don't trust the $60 billion projection for lost revenue that they may be giving up by not implementing their original scheme, because prices are volatile. And you know what? They're right. And you need a tax arrangement that appropriately suits rewarding Australians if there is a windfall gain when prices are particularly high, but also that encourages exploration at times when prices are low or there is added cost to exploration.
Tim,
and I think that's a very reasonable position.
There were some interesting results out today in the mining industry. BHP had a $10.5 billion profit over half a year. Rio Tinto about $14 billion over a full year. You don't think those companies could afford to pay some more tax?
Well, as I said, I always in principle support lower taxes, so no matter what happens, I'm always going to say lower tax. But that's why it matters so much that when we go through and look at where the